Today I'm going to talk about the presidential line of succession in the United States. In previous videos, I've looked at the line of succession to the British throne, as well as the line of succession to the Japanese throne. Even though the U.S. head of state is not a hereditary monarch, the country does still have a line of succession, just in case a president dies, is incapacitated, resigns, or is removed due to impeachment. And of course, it is that last possibility that is being talked about these days. So first of all, I'm going to explain how the line of succession works using the current situation as an example. Then I'll take a look at some past situations and show you how the line of succession came into play during those moments. So most people are familiar with the fact that the United States has both a president and a vice president. And I think most people are also aware of the fact that if anything were to happen to a U.S. president during his or her tenure, it is the vice president that immediately gets sworn in as the replacement. So that makes the vice president number one in the line of succession. Currently, that person is Mike Pence. Now, if you're not from the US, it's this next part that might be new information for you. What most countries call a parliament, the US calls Congress. And in the US, the Congress has two houses. The lower house is called the House of Representatives, and the upper house is called the Senate. The leader of the party with the most seats in the lower house is called the Speaker of the House, and that person is second in the line of succession. So currently we have an interesting situation. The president belongs to the Republican Party, which is the more conservative party, and is indicated on this chart with the color red. However, the current Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is a member of the Democratic Party, which is the more liberal party. They are shown in blue. So in the unlikely event that something would happen to both the president and the vice president at the same time, the Speaker of the House would quickly be sworn in as president, regardless of his or her party membership. Now in the Senate, the leader of the party with the most seats is called the Senate Majority Leader. That person is currently Mitch McConnell. But the Senate Majority Leader is not actually in the line of succession. Instead, whichever senator holds the title President pro tempore is next in line. The President pro tempore is always the longest serving senator at any given time. So once again, that person could be a member of either party. Currently, it's a Republican named Chuck Grassley. He's currently number 3. The remaining individuals in the line of succession are all members of the president's cabinet. These are executive positions appointed by the president himself and confirmed by the Senate. They are ordered according to the relative importance of the position. So at number 4, we get the Secretary of State, which is the U.S. equivalent of Minister of Foreign Affairs. We then get the Secretary of the Treasurer, the Secretary of Defense, and the Attorney General. The list actually continues on after this and includes another 10 or so less important cabinet members. But on this chart, I opted just to show the first 7 individuals in the line of succession. Now, unlike royal lines of succession, the U.S. presidential line of succession often changes quite frequently. In fact, during the Trump administration, it has changed even more than usual. For example, of the top 4 cabinet positions, Only Steve Mnuchin was there at the beginning of the Trump presidency. So earlier in the number 4 slot, we had Rex Tillerson. In this spot, we had Jim Mattis, who was notable because he was an independent. And in the number 7 slot originally was Jeff Sessions. We also had different people representing the House and Senate at this time last year. At that time, Republican Paul Ryan was number 2 in line because prior to the midterm elections, the Republicans held control of the lower house. And third in line was Orrin Hatch. He lost his place in the line of succession when he resigned. Okay, so now that you know the basics of how the line of succession works, let's now look at 2 examples from the past when the line of succession actually came into play. The most recent president to die in office was John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1963. In that case, the vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was sworn in as president just 1 hour and 38 minutes after JFK was declared dead at the hospital. For over 1 year after the assassination of JFK, the office of vice president was actually vacant, and therefore during that time, the Speaker of the House, John McCormick, would have been first in line. I'll also point out that the Kennedy administration was the only time in which a close blood relative to the president was in the line of succession. That's because JFK's younger brother Bobby served as his attorney general. Now, the line of succession actually came into play another time even more recently than JFK. That was when we had the only president in U.S. history to ever resign, Richard Nixon. And that, of course, was due to the Watergate scandal, something you're probably going to be hearing a lot more about in the months to come. In November of 1972, Richard Nixon was reelected for a second term, along with his vice president, Spiro Agnew. But over the next year or so, it came out that Nixon was involved in a cover-up. Basically, what happened was that some of his top people carried out a plan that involved illegally wiretapping the Democrats during the election campaign. This took place at a hotel and office complex called the Watergate, hence the name of the scandal. Anyway, some of the people on the ground got caught, and then Nixon helped cover up his administration's role. At the same time, Vice President Agnew was accused of separate crimes involving corruption and tax fraud. So there was a possibility that both the president and vice president could end up losing their jobs. That opened up the possibility of Carl Albert, a Democrat, becoming president. In order to avoid that, here's what happened. Agnew resigned first and took a plea bargain. This allowed Nixon and the Republicans time to put someone in the number 1 spot that would be safe in the event that Nixon was impeached. Now, they didn't actually have to choose someone that was already in the line of succession, and in fact, they did not. They chose Gerald Ford, who was the Republican leader in the House of Representatives. Had the Republicans controlled the House, Ford would have been in the second spot instead of Albert. But it didn't matter because Nixon placed Ford directly into the vice presidency, making him the automatic backup plan. And as it turned out, that backup plan was in fact necessary. When it became clear that Nixon was going to get impeached, he opted to resign instead. Ford became president, and then a month later issued Nixon a presidential pardon, meaning that Nixon could not be tried for his crimes. We now come to the big question on everyone's mind. What would happen if Donald Trump were to be impeached? And what would happen if Mike Pence went down at the same time? Well, first of all, let me say that I'm not going to share my opinion on whether or not Trump or Pence should be impeached, or even whether or not I would like to see them be impeached. Instead, I am simply going to state what I think is likely to happen if, and at this stage, it still is a big if, things were to go downhill for Trump and or Pence. Obviously, if things went sour for Trump, but not for Pence, Trump could be impeached or could resign, and we would simply get a President Pence. He would probably then pardon Trump, name a new person as vice president, and together he and the new vice president would run for re-election in 2020. But what if things went bad for both Trump and Pence? Well, there's a sort of wishful thinking out there among some Democrats that we could actually end up with a President Pelosi in that scenario. Personally, I think that's actually very unlikely, and here's why. I think what's more likely to happen is something similar to what happened with Nixon and Agnew. Pence would probably resign first. This would give the Republicans the opportunity to put a safe person in the vice presidency, just like they did with Ford. Then, if it looked almost certain that Trump was going to be impeached, you'd probably see Trump resign instead, and then that new unknown person would suddenly become president. And in this scenario, that new president would likely pardon both Trump and Pence. So what's the lesson in all of this? Well, I think it's that the presidential line of succession isn't really a true line of succession. First, it changes too often. And second, it's pretty easy to circumvent. In reality, it wasn't really designed for situations like the one Nixon found himself in, or the one that Trump might find himself in. Instead, it was designed more for really unforeseen tragedies, like if a president gets shot, or if the president and a bunch of high-ranking officials all get attacked at the same time. There's a TV show called Designated Survivor in which the Capitol building gets bombed during a State of the Union address, and therefore everyone in the line of succession dies at the same time, except one person, the so-called designated survivor. Now, in case you're wondering if the designated survivor is actually a real thing, yes, it actually is. During the last State of the Union, Secretary of Energy Rick Perry was the designated survivor. So that was a look at the U.S. presidential line of succession. Do let me know in the comments what you think is likely to happen in the months ahead.